There you are. You have reduced your carbon footprint, but you cannot seem to cut those residual emissions. This is when carbon offsetting comes in. From a global warming perspective, a ton of CO2 emitted by a food truck in France has the same impact as a ton emitted by a copper mine in Peru, even if the two have nothing in common. The same goes for avoided emissions. If a company, a city, or individuals cannot reduce their own emissions, they can support emission reductions elsewhere. A project which triggers emission reductions is called a carbon project. Such projects can take a variety of forms: replacing diesel plants by renewable energy, refurbishing industrial installations, using landfill methane emissions to produce energy, planting trees, etc. The EU ETS, for example, used to rely on project-based mechanisms to provide flexibility to covered European industries. Companies could finance carbon offsets instead of meeting their individual cap, or buy extra emission allowances. Companies which don't have any compliance target but want to have a comprehensive climate strategy can rely on voluntary certification standards like the Gold Standard, VCS or national standards to finance carbon projects. Since the late 2000s, voluntary carbon projects helped to avoid over 437.1 megatons of CO2 emissions, the equivalent to not consuming over 1 billion barrels of oil. So, how can we make sure that financing a carbon project helps to reduce global emissions? In order to certify avoided emissions, carbon projects must meet precise specifications. Firstly, they should represent a real improvement over a no-project case. Consider that you finance gas boilers to replace diesel boilers somewhere in the world. Your certified emission reductions will be the difference between what the oil boilers would have emitted and what the new ones actually emit. Secondly, they should demonstrate what is called their additionality. To be clear, you must prove that the residents would not have changed their boiler without your contribution. Otherwise, your project will not be certified. Finally, reduced emissions cannot be counted twice. It's either them or you. Now, what is new with the Paris Agreement? Carbon reduction projects emerged under the Kyoto Protocol, yet the Paris Agreement breathed new life into emissions mitigation and offsetting mechanisms. New guidelines are being discussed under Article 6 of the agreement to take over the Kyoto Protocol in facilitating international carbon reduction projects. New actors, such as the international airline industry, plan to use voluntary carbon markets to achieve their climate targets. Voluntary carbon markets could also develop in the coming years if they manage to provide private and public actors with options to achieve national climate targets. Countries themselves are more and more looking for domestic action and developing their own national offsetting standards. Carbon offsetting appears as a relevant transition tool to start decreasing our emissions now at a low price and prepare for a deeper transformation of our society and lifestyle. However, everyone should now strive for carbon neutrality. The only way to physically offset our emissions is through carbon removals, also called negative emissions, such as carbon sequestration in soils, biomass, or through new technologies that may never come. In the end, if we want to reach global carbon neutrality by 2050, we will have to focus on decreasing our own emissions and carefully choose which are the very few, unavoidable, residual emissions to offset.